Lovely. So we're in Evolving Ground Members Book Club. It's July 2023, and we have a guest, Ken McLeod. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
Ken's book, The Magic of Vajrayana, was recently published, and we've been reading and discussing that book over the last couple of months, led by Vinod and Max. I just want to shout out to both of you and appreciate the sessions that you've run, that you've hosted, that you have really enlivened the discussion with your hosting. So thanks for that. So Ken is visiting us today. He's going to answer some questions. He's going to bring the contents and the practices in the book even more alive for us than they already are. And I know they really are alive for a number of people here who have been practicing the guided practices in the book. So at this point in time, Evolving Ground, we're in our third year. We're establishing ground. And I just want to say, Ken, that it's an important occasion for us. It's a significant point in time for a number of reasons. You are our first visiting author and teacher of Vajrayana, and it seems incredibly appropriate and congruent that is so. I think it's not a coincidence. Your work and your presence has greatly impacted many of Evolving Ground members, many of us. Right from the start, your influence has been with us. I remember we were in very early apprentice groups, and we were discussing how to have our practice labs, like what kind of model would we use? And we looked at various different models. And one of the ones that really stood out to us were videos of you with students, with people talking, asking questions, and a kind of a mode of inquiry that resonated for us, that really helped people explore their own personal experience in relation to the practice, the method, the framework, whatever it was. And so we adopted a particular model in our apprentice groups, in our practice labs, that actually comes from watching videos of you. So thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm not sure what videos you were watching.
It was a few years ago now, so I'm sure we could find them. We could let you know. Small groups. They were small groups. So small group Q&As, and very often you would ask a follow-up question and explore something with somebody.
I found that very important, actually. I did, I guess about a year, maybe more. I did a monthly Q&A session at another center, because I didn't have an actual center space myself. And it was just a Q&A session. I didn't give talks. And I found that just working with one person on their question and how to, and these were all practice-related questions, how to move them in deeper into their experience of practice. And everybody else who was listening would just listen, but they would go through the same process or something comparable. I found actually it was an extraordinarily effective way of getting points across without getting into theoretical discussions.
And that's interesting. It's something that we have often explored. It's so easy to get off into a theoretical or abstract discussion, which can be interesting, can be very interesting sometimes, but finding ways to bring it back to the personal has been an ongoing exploration for us. I remember a number of conversations that Jared and I have had about teaching models, teacher-student models in traditional Vajrayana, and how could we most appropriately translate those models or bring them alive in this very different context. And we ended out thinking about learning relationships and having that phrase, learning relationship, to describe more the function of what happens. And it was really delightful for me to hear that that is something that you have come to yourself through all of your experience in the traditions, that you've kind of landed also in that that field of emphasizing the learning aspect.
Well, I came to it in a strange way. Do any of you remember the movie based on one of Le Carre's novels, The Constant Gardener? I think it's one about Africa. Anybody remember that movie? It's quite a few years ago. Yeah. But the hero's girlfriend is murdered. She's working for an NGO in Africa, and she's murdered. And he goes to investigate what happened. And he finds that the crucial information is locked on a hard disk, and he can't get into it. So a 12-year-old nephew of his girlfriend is, he just gives the hard disk to him, and within a day, he's found a way into it. Not an unusual thing in the tech world. And I asked myself, so how did this 12-year-old learn how to do that? Because he obviously hadn't had a teacher or a mentor. He hadn't taken any computer programming or computer science classes or anything like that. I realized, well, he figured out how to do this because he played. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. There are other ways of learning than from a teacher. And then I came across a book called Community Learning, I think. I've got it here. That may not be quite the right title. And it explores this whole business. And that led me to really reevaluate what a teacher's role was. And one of the ways that I came to it is a little broader than maybe you're talking about learning relationships. Oh, it was learning communities. That's right. That was the name of the book. Is that I saw that the one way to look at the teacher's role is to create environments in which learning can take place. And I rather like that approach or that way of looking at it because it downplayed the role of the teacher-student thing. And it became not about teaching, but about learning. And I found that very fruitful because it opened up a lot of other possibilities. Not everybody was enthusiastic about this. Some of the students resisted quite strongly because they actually didn't want to learn. They just wanted to be told. And a lot of teachers really resisted it because they rather attached to their roles as a teacher. Or at least that's one of the reasons anyway. So I thought it was interesting. When I noticed that learning relationships, I said, oh yeah, this is good. So I'm very glad to hear that you're doing that kind of thinking and thought. I think it's really important at this stage of, I won't even say Vajrayana unless I would say Buddhism in the West. Because I think it applies hugely in Zen, because most Zen centers, not all of them, but most Zen centers are very much have adopted the pseudo-Confucian model that permeates Zen in Japan. And then there's other aspects that come up in the Theravadan tradition too. But interestingly enough, the Koreans have something similar. That is that whoever is the main teacher is takes relatively little part in the retreat, and is there only for people to have conversations with him, usually individually, about their practice. The actual program and what the retreat is about, et cetera, is decided by people lower in the hierarchy. And for the most part, people go to retreat just to practice, and then they seek out resources in like the appropriate person to talk to about particular issues that are coming up in their practice. So I thought that was very interesting too. Anyway, where would you like to start?
Well, that's just to respond there, Ken, that's lovely to hear you talk about how you came to that understanding and how, it fits very nicely with how we've been thinking about roles and then functions, and actually moving away from that kind of fixed reification of a particular role or expectations, which I think is actually a lot of pressure both for people in a learning situation and for teachers or people who are more in a mentoring or guiding situation, because we're all still learning.
Well, if I could stay on this topic just for a little bit longer. In the Magic of Vajrayana, as well as in Wake Up to Your Life, I talk about three roles or three functions of a teacher in the context of spiritual practice. And there could be more, but these three are fairly comprehensive. One role is the teacher shows or reveals possibilities to a student. And that can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be by how the teacher lives, or how the teacher moves, how the teacher teaches, or ways of seeing, experiencing, or understanding the world, which the student just didn't know was possible. And I remember one student I had for a while was a minor mover and shaker in Hollywood. And he said the most important thing that he learned from me was that his thoughts were not reality. Now, if you're coming from a meditation perspective, the idea that somebody would say that is just like absurd. But an extraordinary number of people never learn to distinguish the world out there, so to speak, and from their thoughts. And this was huge. And then he went on to do a lot of very, very serious Zen sessions with a teacher in the LA area. But that's what I mean about revealing possibilities, the idea that his thoughts were not reality. It's like, oh, and just opens up a whole world, of course. Second function of a teacher is to train you in the skills and capabilities that you're going to need in spiritual practice. And that is meditation skills, quite possibly some living skills, life skills, and also, building a capacity for attention, because what I found over and over again is that people tackle practices like Mahamudra or Dzogchen, and they don't have the capacity to do so. And the problem with that is that if they don't have the capacity, they try instead to compensate for that with their intellect. They try to understand Dzogchen. They try to understand Mahamudra. You just can't get anywhere doing that. But when you build up the capacity, then you begin to see things because you're able to see them, and there isn't anything to understand. It's something you can actually do. And the third function of a teacher is to point out where you're getting in your own way, where your old habits and things like that, stuff, cultural issues, you name it, is preventing you from seeing or doing something or approaching your practice in a certain way, and so forth. what I found is that generally speaking, Westerners look for all three functions in a given individual. And that's when it speaks to what you're referring to, Charlie, that it creates a lot of pressure and strain, because some teachers are extremely good at revealing possibilities. Others are very good at training abilities. And others are very good at seeing what is actually getting in somebody's way. So later in my teaching career, I encouraged students, you can find these three things in different people. And there's a long history of this in the Tibetan tradition, that often a student would meet a teacher once and receive a pointing out instruction. And sometimes it wasn't even an instruction, it was just being in the presence. And it would just open up all kinds of possibilities. They might never see that teacher again or have no other interaction with them, and yet they would regard them as a root teacher because of what they came to see was possible through that interaction. And other people, other teachers have had other relationships with other ones. So I think it's useful to understand that there's a lot of different functions of a teacher, and they don't have to be all in the same person.
That rings true. And it's very reassuring to hear you say that, Cam. Talking of building up capacity, Marie, I think, has a question around setting up a practice group for example, for the White Tara practice that you mentioned in your book, that you introduce us to. Marie, do you have your question? Could you speak to that question?
Sure. So in Evolving Ground, our learning model is based on personal study through books and online courses, also peer-to-peer learning in small groups. And some of us have personal practice coaches. So obviously the traditional guru model, as you describe it in the book, doesn't really function for us. Maybe there are some elements that function, but the guru model doesn't really function. So how might transmission of deity practice function absent the guru model? So let's say I wanted to start a practice and study group where we did White Tara practice together on Zoom. I just wonder if you had any recommendations.
This is an open question at this point. I know of two highly respected Tibetan teachers who now have recorded the empowerment ceremony. One is for Vajrayana, which is extremely wrathful deity. I think the other one's for Yamataka, which is another manifestation of the Manjusri line. And this may have been precipitated by COVID, but I think it actually, at least in one case, it precedes COVID. And so if a student wants to do that practice, they watch the video, and watching the video constitutes receiving the empowerment. And with my background, where I went over to India and met my teacher there, and the whole thing, that just seemed like a little strange. And I've been asked since the book Magic of Vajrayana came out a number of times if reading the empowerment ritual of White Tara constitutes an empowerment, because several people have written to me, say they had very powerful experiences and that really clarified something, and they were able to approach deity practice in a different way. And I have to confess that, at least from my perspective, I imagine there is a more active engagement of material in reading the book than there might be in watching a video. And so, though I don't feel I can be stating a set position, it seems to me that if watching a video constitutes empowerment, then reading that chapter may constitute an empowerment. At least I think it's an open question. And in that same chapter, I also detail a number of different ways that an empowerment is transmitted. And I think what's important here, Marie, is that, and this is something that I've done all the time that I've been teaching, like what actually is an empowerment? And if you remove it from the form in which it took in Tibetan culture, which was, at least my impression is, in some ways significantly different from the form it took in Indian culture, say. Some significant overlaps, of course, but things change. I think one way that I've thought about empowerment is that the purpose of the empowerment ritual or ceremony is the planting of a seed of experience. Now, if we take that as the essence of empowerment, then almost anything which plants a seed of experience could be regarded as an empowerment. It broadens things out and allows things to take a lot of different forms. And that's one of the reasons I do these kind of investigations, because I see forms in the Tibetan tradition that just don't work in the West for all kinds of reasons. So I try to figure out what is the essence, what's really going on in that form, and then see what are ways that we might accomplish the same thing in forms that are more suitable for Western culture. And so if you're, well, let's talk about White Tara specifically, and then I want to talk a little more broadly. If you're talking about White Tara specifically, then what is a way that you might come up with, not necessarily involving you, may or may not, that plants a seed of experience of being White Tara in the student? And this can be anything from revealing the possibility would be planting a seed, or acting something out. You know, sometimes when you just act something out, it plants a seed of experience which matures into an actual experience sometime later. I remember when I was learning the Tibetan instruments, there's one which is like a shama or primitive oboe, double reed instrument, which you do circular breathing in order to keep a continuous tone. And by the time the retreat started, it was almost ready to start. I had learned one tune on this. And the idea of playing one tune for 3 years just did not. So I went to one of the lamas who was very good at jamming. He said, "Could you teach me another tune?" And so we went off together with a couple of jammings, and he showed me the fingering and how it worked. And when I had more or less got the tune down, and it was time for us to go to evening ritual or something, he said, "Give me your arm." And I went, "What?" He said, "Just give me your arm." So I stuck my arm out, and he put his fingers on my arm in the same way as if my arm was the instrument. I say it's like an oboe. And then he played the tune on my arm. There wasn't any sound, of course. And I went, how interesting. He's planting the tune in my body. So as we approach these kinds of questions, and we're very much in the process of transitioning things here, I think, and I'm speaking more broadly now, I think there are two things that are very important. One is to come to as deep an understanding as we're capable of what a particular ceremony, ritual, teaching, whatever, is really about. And because every culture has its own form of expression. But if you really drill down and what is this actually about? Then you open up all kinds of possibilities of the same thing happening, but in very, very different ways. So as case, I suppose in this, what I'm talking about in terms of creative thinking here is a very, very deep convergence first, so that you get really clear about what things are, and then the possibility of divergence into different forms that are appropriate. And I've done that several times, both in teaching. One way I did actually was in a course on dual ornament liberation. I decided to make it base it on Jeopardy. And so I don't know how familiar you are with dual ornament liberation, but it's one of the main training texts in the Kagyu tradition, written by Gampopa in the 12th century, I guess, 11th, somewhere around there. And it's a Lamrim, graded path text. And so it talks about Buddha nature and the precious human existence and the spiritual teacher and all these things, and it goes through loving karma and suffering and 6 realms and everything, right up to bodhicitta and 6 perfections and so forth and so forth. But I started off the course saying, I go, what question is Buddha nature the answer to? What question is precious human existence the answer to? What question is refuge the answer to? And so forth and so forth. Because I wanted people to think about these things in different, and it was very interesting by asking that these were all of these concepts and things that we come across in the Tibetan tradition are answers to very, very specific questions. But if we don't know the question, we don't really understand the answer. You can learn all you want about the answer as a formula, but if you don't actually understand the question, it doesn't really mean very much. So I was encouraging students to really think about, what is the question here? Okay, that's all I have to say on that one. Does this help, Mary?
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that's coming to me is we would work together as a group and really go into the text and see what parts of us come alive, what parts of the text come alive for us, because I think that Yidam practice is highly individual in the ways that the energy of the Yidam manifests for a person. So when I go through your text, my first impulse is, okay, how do I customize this so it works for me? And
very natural, but not the best approach.
Yeah, I struggle with long texts, and reciting long texts, and so I have to find my own way into these practices. So I think, if I was working with a small group, then we would just have to find our own way into that practice. But
well, you touch on, but I think what has come to me to be a very important point. Have any of you seen the film Babaziz? B-A-B-A-Z-I-Z. Its subtitle is The Prince Who Contemplated His Soul. It's a one of a trilogy, I think made by an Iranian filmmaker, filmed in Tunisia. Babazi, you can rent it on Amazon. I know that. At least you used to be able to. Babaziz, I think you'll get it on that. It's about a Sufi teacher and his grandniece who are on their way to a gathering of mystics in a certain location. It's a very touching story, a little bewildering in some places. But if you have the time, I've watched it several times and I think it's quite a lovely film. But there's a line in it which is actually a well-known Sufi saying. And it's, there are as many ways to God as there are individuals in the universe, as there are beings in the universe. And in Buddhism, we talk about the 84,000 teachings. Well, 84,000 is just a way of saying a really large number. And I think it's also a way of saying everybody's path is different. I was once asked to be part of a film that was on the non-dual vision that is present in all cultures. And I was very pleased to be invited to this, but I wrote back to the email, the director, said, I said, I'd be very happy to participate and quite honored, but I think you should know that what you take as a statement of fact, I take as a question. And 15 minutes later, an email appeared. What are you talking about? I said, well, no, the phone rang, that's right. He said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you talk about this non-dual vision that's common to all cultures. But I'm very well aware that if you and I both take a slice of same strawberry rhubarb pie, we have no idea whether we actually have the same experience tasting it. And so I take it as a very open question whether there is a common experience of non-duality, because we can't even agree on the taste of the rhubarb pie. 15 minutes later, an email appeared, says, you're not suitable for this movie. One of the strengths of Buddhism, which I respect and appreciate very deeply, is its clarity and the power of its formulations, which I just think are fantastic. But as a friend of mine intimated, Stephen Batchelor, and something I've taken very much to heart, sometimes the power of the answers can overwhelm the stammering voice that asks the questions. And I've really, in my own teaching and work with students, I've always made a very strong effort to hear the stammering voice and try to prevent the power, even in my own answers, from smothering that voice. That's been quite important to me. Haven't always succeeded, but and so when you talk about deity practice, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It can be completely different for different people. And if you take the analogy of music, I think I find music a very helpful analogy. No two people play the same piece the same way. And yet they're both right. So I think something to keep in mind.
Okay, thanks. I'll let you know how it goes if I start a group.
Good luck.
We've had a number of conversations over the years around experience and characterizing experience with language that resonates for different people and different circumstances, and how do we have language that we can have a shared language when experience is so individual. It's one of the topics that we've touched on here and there again and again. So thanks for that question, Marie. I know that you have a number of other questions as well, very practice-based, and I want us to move on to some other people who are sitting with their questions. Phil, I know that you have you've been thinking about this a lot, and you've been thinking also in that realm of the voice of an author, the voice of a learner, the voice of a teacher. So do you want to speak to what you've been thinking about a little and form that into a question?
Sure. Thank you for being here, Ken. I'm interested to hear your perspective on how your writing style relates to your teaching style and to the kinds of things that you are trying to teach. So I'll share some of my impressions of your writing style and see if you agree with how I see it, with how I characterize it, and then just ask you to reflect on that relationship between your teaching style and your writing style. I found your book to be, and your writing style in general, there's something a little bit elusive about it, mostly because you have a style of kind of letting things speak for themselves. So you'll describe a meditation state in your own words without necessarily contextualizing it. So the phrase clear, empty knowing pops up over and over in Magic of Vajrayana, but is not in your glossary. That would be one example. And then in reading the book, a lot of us discussed the story of your burnout during your second, third year retreat, and people drew a lot of different sort of lessons, took a lot of different conclusions about what, if anything, you intended the reader to learn from that story. And so we had a lot of different perspectives. Some people thought you were encouraging us, the readers, to be faithful and to stick it out, and it'll all work out in the end. Other people thought that you were more ambivalent about the experience. And in a lot of ways, your writing style, to me, echoes some of the teachers you describe, who seem to teach by making enigmatic statements and providing instructions without a lot of additional explanation, and then they expect their students to kind of grapple with what they provide without a lot of additional assistance. So I'm just wondering if you see any common ground between my take on your writing and your own, and how you feel that your writing style relates to your teaching style and to the kinds of subjects that you are attempting to convey.
I think what you infer or inferred from my writing style, as you put it, they're all valid inferences. That they weren't present. I don't think any of them were present in me when I was writing the book. And there are 2 or 3 directions I can go here. You sent, or Charlie sent the question. So I've been mulling over it for a day or so. I'm a little curious. What's the question behind the question?
Marie had warned us that you might respond with another question.
She's a very bad person.
So I've been thinking about that, and I think the first answer would be I'm not entirely sure myself. But I would say that I find, the question of faith is very important in your book, and the question, and that's seems related to an issue that is sort of very important in evolving ground that we talk about a lot, which is autonomy. And there becomes a point when you're being taught by somebody and they may make a statement that is hard to understand, or that I feel is incomplete. I'm like, why didn't they explain it more? Why is there something I can't put my finger on here? And I'm sort of invited to either leave my doubts behind and try the idea on for size, so to speak, or maybe even commit to the idea when I don't understand, or maybe just retain my skepticism, but it feels like there's a kind of step that I'm being asked to make. But then again, I don't know if I'm projecting that. So, I just think it's kind of a rich topic, like what the student brings, where faith might cross into just sort of making excuses or projecting, as perhaps I have done in making all of my reasonable inferences on your book. So I'm just curious to hear. I'm trying to spark something, and I'm not sure. I don't think I know what it would be yet.
Well, thank you. I feel that's very helpful. Very helpful. Have you read IQ 84?
Yes.
Then you're familiar with the quotation. If you can't understand it without an explanation, you can't understand it with an explanation. I think that's worth remembering. Your question is about faith. And I imagine, and please correct me, or that there's faith lapsing into belief and the problems with that. Autonomy, as you say, that whole little nexus. First off, I mean, after I read your question, I went, that's interesting. And you're right. I left clear, empty knowing out of the glossary. That was an omission. And unfortunately, it's a little too late to get. Well, I might be able to get reissued in the paperback or something, but that would be kind of, oh well. This is not a beginner's book. And it's never intended to be. So, and this is not a defense, because I think I should have put something in the glossary on that subject. You're absolutely right. But I think part of the reason I might not have, or what might be part of the reason, is that I'm just making the bald assumption that anybody who reads this book has had some experience of clear, empty knowing. So, but that may be too much of an assumption, and so there it is. Well, thank you for pointing that out.
Could I check? Are you in clear, empty knowing? Are you translating a particular Tibetan phrase there? Is that Nepa? Is it something else, or is it more of a general
Well,
spatial awareness?
and that's part of the, it's a very good question, Charlie. It's part of the challenge here. One of the things that I've tried to do is to develop a vocabulary for, how I try to talk about or convey Buddhist understanding, which, and this speaks somewhat to your point, Phil, what I like to say evolves with the student. And my first conscious effort in this direction, and was really very, very deliberate, was I wanted to come up with a way of a meditation instruction that would last the student a very long time, that they can go through many levels of understanding and the instruction would still serve them. And the one that and I wanted this because when I first came to Los Angeles, I was dealing with people who really didn't know anything at all about Buddhism. And even if they'd been part of Buddhist centers, things like that, they really didn't know anything about Buddhism. And so I was teaching them a lot of resting with the breath and so forth. And the vocabulary of concentration, which is used in the Theravadan translations, is just, it would just, I would say to people, concentrate is what you do to oranges, to get orange juice. Because it's not the right way to approach meditation. At least it wasn't for me and most of the people I know. And the instruction or the form, the wording that I eventually came up with is return to what is already, whenever you notice that you're distracted, return to what is already there and rest. And when you're first starting meditation, what's already there is your breath. And so you rest with the breath. And I emphasize resting with the breath or resting in the experience of breathing rather than focusing on the breathing. These are subtle changes in vocabulary, made huge difference in people's practice. But as you keep coming back and resting on the breath, then you realize, oh, the body's already there. So now you rest on the experience of the body breathing, which is a more expansive practice, and you're already beginning to move into an ecstatic component of breath practice. And what's already there, your experience of the world is already there. So now you're resting on the breath in your experience of life. And this just makes the transition from sitting meditation to being present in your life much, much simpler because you're already practicing. And then you realize, oh, there's kind of an awareness there that's just there. And that's awareness of the breath. But rather than the breath, you begin, oh, that awareness, that's always there. So you begin to rest. When you turn, you just rest in the experience of awareness and so forth. And it just deepens. So that's why clear, empty knowing is another phrase, which I hope evolves with the student. And that's why, I mean, of course, on one hand, certain point, it's Rigpa in Tibetan. But Rigpa has been made into a thing in such a way that I just don't think it's useful. Everybody talks about Rigpa, Rigpa, Rigpa. The view, and all this stuff. And once something is reified, it becomes useless for meditation purposes because people grab onto it. And so, and certainly the same fate is probably going to happen to clear, empty knowing. It's happened to everything else. But I hope it's a little resistant to it, if you see what I mean. I mean, the great example of this is empty. I have had so many conversations with people who want to get rid of the word. And I say, no, it works extremely well. It continues to do what it was always meant to do. And they say, what do you mean? Well, look, in Sanskrit, the word is empty, and it's the same word for you. It's an empty box or it's empty space or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's empty. And the Tibetan word tongpa, if you want to talk about an empty box, you say it's empty. It's the same word. So why don't we use the same word in English? Because it does what it was meant to do. And they say, well, what's that? It stops you thinking. And that's exactly what they hate about it. Because
I don't like it, Ken. I don't like that word at all. Seriously. Yeah,
I know. It's wonderful.
It's interesting because I see it causing people to think too hard. And so one of the reasons that I try to use different words is, there's just like 2,000 years of people arguing about it.
I know, but that's because it stops the mind. I mean, you can't really, you're not the first person to want to think about, to notice this problem about people thinking about it. Good grief. How many kinds of emptiness are in the Tibetan tradition?
Right,
yeah, 16 in the 18. But have you ever gone into them?
Yeah. So the book that we studied previously to Magic of Vajrayana in the book club was Rob Babea's Seeing That Frees. So we certainly did. We certainly did have lots of going into different sorts of emptiness.
Well, the 16 or 18 different kinds of emptiness are all very, very specific things, which I found quite fascinating, specific aspects of emptiness. Yes, it has provoked a tremendous amount of thinking. Why? Okay, so one of the two spells that I offer in the book is for beginning deity meditation is I am empty, timeless awareness. Now, it really doesn't matter who you are. You could be a Buddha, you could be a hell being, or you could be, even worse, one of the God realms. You can't say that phrase without your mind stopping. Your mind just, the conceptual mind just goes, and there you are. And see, it became very clear to me at a certain point, and I spoke a little bit about this earlier. Understanding is very important in the study of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism. But it's very important to understand what can be understood and what can be only experienced. There's a very important distinction there. And what I found very, very often is people exert a tremendous amount of effort trying to understand things that cannot be understood. And my father was wonderful about this. I gave him can't remember what book it was. And he read it. He was very good sport about these things. And then he said, Ken, I don't understand why you're doing this. It says right here, you can't understand it. It's perfection of wisdom or something like that. And you can't understand emptiness. My little quip on that is emptiness, there's nothing to it. Nobody laughed. Okay, that one went flat. But that's the point. And so, I had a similar conversation, Charlie, with one of the people who interviewed me on their podcast, Matthew O'Connell. I don't know. And he feels very much the same way you do about emptiness. And
I think it's one of those, it feels like a slippery word. to me. And yet, yeah, you know,
And yet it
I
works.
still, I confess, I do still use it sometimes.
Phil, did I respond to your questions adequately?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Well, yeah, but let me talk a little bit about faith, because as you say, I make a big deal of faith. Let me put it this way. How familiar are you with music?
Very. I'm a musician.
Okay, so how about Eric Satie's Gymnopede #1?
Not at all.
Oh,
Tiny
really?
bit.
No, you've heard the tune because it's played all over the place. But you can look it up. I'm just using that example. Okay, let's take, what kind of music do you play?
Jazz.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I think a few people have used Satie and jazz. Dave Brubeck, Take 5.
Yes.
What do you experience when you hear that?
There are sensations, the melody. There's kind of like a story to the melody itself, because you're only hearing one note at a time, so you're kind of remembering it as you hear it. There's something that it's like a sculpture in time a little bit. And there are memories,
Mm-hmm.
controversial. Other times I've heard the song.
And it's in
But yeah.
5/4, right?
What's that?
And it's in 5/4.
Yes.
And does it ever occur to you while you're listening to it that it's in 5/4?
Only when I put on my technical musician hat.
Exactly. That's my point. You know, it doesn't engage the intellect. And when we study the piece, it's like some kind of miracle. I was with a musician friend of mine who we went to hear. He was a student of mine, and we went to hear another student of mine who was singing at this Bulgarian folk gathering. And we walked in, they were doing this weird, not weird dance, but this dance, but it was quite intricate rhythmically. And my friend was an extremely good guitarist. And I love his work. I was fascinated by this, and eventually figured it out was in 7/4. But there's this music to enjoy, and this one puzzling aspect to it. So I bring this up, or this example up, is that there's an experience there which is extremely alive, and it doesn't involve any conceptual understanding. Now, going back to Marie's question, this is extremely important when it comes to deity meditation. I don't know, it wasn't mentioned in the questions that were sent to me, and maybe there's some questions here about this, but you'll notice that I don't talk about visualization in the book. The word in Tibetan is mikpa. And I've always had trouble with that term. It's generally, almost universally translated as visualize. In the context of deity meditation, and in the context of deity meditation alone. It comes up in all kinds of other contexts, and it's never translated as visualized in those other contexts. I asked a Sanskrit expert who knows Tibetan also. And I said, what does mikpa mean? And he said, we don't even understand what the Sanskrit refers to. It's a very elusive, to use your word, elusive term. And when I came to writing this book, and this is going back to the first part of your question, Phil, then my main concern when I'm writing a book is that when somebody reads it, something happens. I try to write in such a way that every sentence elicits an experience. That's quite intentional. And I'm not, the book isn't done until it has that, as much as I've been able to do that. I don't necessarily get it with every sentence, but that's what I'm aiming for. And that may be why you regarded the book as elusive, or the style as elusive. That it's very, very much about eliciting experience, because I feel that if I'm successful in eliciting an experience in the reader, then the reader knows what I'm trying to talk about, even if they don't have any conceptual understanding of it at all. In the same way that we have this experience of listening to Take 5 and don't even realize that it's in this odd time signature that almost nobody writes. And this is the struggles that we're having in the West about this is nothing new. This goes back to the time of the Buddha, probably even before then, where people struggled to understand things that really could only be experienced. And a friend of mine introduced me to, he liked to use the word mystery, and that was his definition of mystery, something that can be understood, can be experienced, but can't be understood conceptually. And there's a very famous Indian story, or series of stories called The King and the Corpse, which is all about this. And there's been translations of parts of it. Quite fascinating reading. So this moves into the area of faith, because as I was writing this book, I've always made a distinction between faith and belief, but I had to dig deeper. And in my research, I came across the very interesting idea. In the Catholic Church, faith is regarded as a higher form of knowing. And I actually use that phrase in the book once or twice. And I think it's a really useful door, because I think most of us have had the experience of knowing something, but not knowing how we know it. And when somebody asks us, how do you know that? Well, we can't answer it. It's there. And sometimes we've forgotten how we know it, but sometimes it comes from somewhere else. And in a way, faith is a way of tapping into, at least, and this is what I found very much through my own practice, faith is a way of tapping into a way of knowing that is not accessible by the conceptual mind. And that is actually the primary importance. Why Guru Yoga is so highly regarded and so emphasized in the Tibetan tradition. that you can tap into a higher form of knowing through faith that you cannot get with your conceptual mind. At the end of the book, I refer to an experience, and it's more than experience, a shift that took place on a break between two retreats I was teaching in New Mexico in 2008, which killed me as a teacher. And I had to stop. Unexpected, but just couldn't teach after that. I was very confused. I was extremely clear on the one hand and utterly bewildered on the other. And I reached out to half a dozen of my Western colleagues. All of whom, with one exception, were disturbingly unhelpful. I was quite puzzled by. And I turned to a couple of Tibetan teachers, and one's quite helpful, but the one that I think was most important said something that's very, very similar to what Nigama said. Yeah, just in chapter 2, I guess it is, just before Nigama melts into light and comes into Chungpa Naljra. Don't think about your teacher or your practice. Don't think about what is real or not real. Don't think about anything at all. Don't control what you experience. Just rest in how you are right now. And he said almost the same thing in almost the same words. He says, don't think about what is true or not true. Don't think about this. Don't think about that. He said, pray to your teacher until you stop thinking and rest there. And at first I was a little skeptical. That's 15 years ago now. And I think he's right. I was more than a little skeptical, let's say. I see faith as probably the most accessible way into emptiness. And this goes back a long way. When I was in the 3-year retreat, I read a short text by Chair Gongpa, who is, I think, the 3rd in the Shangpa lineage. Chungpa Naljra, I think Mochopa, Chair Gongpa, I think that's the order. And he said the true 3 doors to freedom, you have the 3 gates of existence and 3 doors to freedom and so forth, but the true 3 doors to freedom are impermanence, compassion, and faith. Any one of those is sufficient, will mature or flower into the other 2. But it took me a long while really, to understand the very, very deep relationship between faith and insight. Insight is a form of seeing. It's a Tibetan term is Hlap Tong, which is a higher form of seeing. It's a seeing that's not available to the conceptual mind. So you have to step out of the conceptual mind. And you can do it through impermanence. That's basically for anger types. And you can do it through compassion, which is for desire types. And then there's ones for stupid people like me. That's faith. It's Because when you move to the practice of prayer and faith, and you notice probably in my book that I talk about prayer as a way of reaching out to what you do not know. How else do you do it? To reach out to what you do not know, you have to let go of knowing. That's hard. It's really hard. So I think it's a really important point. It's how you form a relationship. You begin to let go of not knowing. You follow?
And I see that many people are moved here at this point. And I think as you've been speaking, you are and have been addressing a number of the questions that arose and that came up. So I appreciate you're doing that on the fly as you're speaking.
Lucky coincidence. But maybe not. I mean, all this stuff is so intimately related. I mean, I've come to the view that if you go deep in the right way, you end up with everything. If you go deep and you end up narrow, then something's gone wrong. So I don't talk about visualizing deity, and I think the word mikpa, I want to go back because this takes us in a somewhat different direction, but I think it's important. The other context, the major context that mikpa comes up is the phrase mikme ninje. Ninje is the word for compassion. Mikme, in this context, does not mean not visualize. Me is the Tibetan negative. So if we were to use the same translation, it would say unvisualized compassion. Which doesn't make much sense at all. And it seems, from what I can understand, that mikpa means something more like holding something in mind. And visualization is a form of doing that. But what you hold in mind in the deity, in deity practice, is being the deity. And one of the ways that I taught deity practice was I wouldn't give people a text or anything. I would say, okay, I want you to go in your practice and in your life. I want you to hold the idea that you are, well, we'll take Chenrezig, for instance, awakened compassion. And as you go about your life and you meet different situations, just ask yourself, what does it mean? What would it mean as awakened compassion? How would I meet this situation? And figure that out. And I have people do this for quite a few months. Now, again, there's the letting go of self involved of that, because you're engaging this idea of being something else. And I found that people's understanding of compassion would deepen extraordinarily. Because we have all these ideas about compassion, but a lot of them simply don't work in practical situations. And so when they actually thought, okay, and they would see how incredibly difficult it is to hold that ethic of compassion sometimes. And so their appreciation and understanding of compassion just deepened. So I thought this is quite fruitful. And I also, the other part of this is that I've run into 3 or 4 people who have extraordinary ability to visualize. And they just said, I can visualize all this, and it just doesn't mean a thing to me. So I went, okay, this can't be what's being talked about in this term in Tibetan. And that's why I took the approach to deity practice I did in this book, because it was creating a lot of problems on the one hand, and it wasn't helping people on another. So
very much appreciate the back story and you sharing your process of how you actually came to be giving Yidam in this particular way that you do in the book.
Yeah, it's what made the book so difficult to write, because I found that I had to over and over again move to a different level of understanding to get across what I really wanted to. I had to come to really develop quite different vocabulary. Just I get lazy sometimes and just use the same vocabulary other people do, but I realized it wasn't working.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting. We've very recently we've been having quite a few conversations about that in itself, that there's a certain point at which to make difference, to indicate something different, there has to be some new language coming into being. It just has to be that way.
well, I probably have gone in a different direction. If you're really thinking about language, I strongly recommend reading Wittgenstein, not the early Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations. Somebody gave me that book very early on. A friend of mine came over to my apartment, handed me the copy that he, from his days at university, and said, read this, this is not negotiable. I was about 23, I guess. Somewhere around there. 20, yeah, 20, 24, 25, somewhere around there. And I didn't understand it philosophically. I didn't appreciate until much, much later the difficult philosophical questions that Wittgenstein was dealing with. I just read the book, and I found that what I learned about language from just reading it was incredible, and I thought it fascinating. And 20 years later, when I was teaching, and I was trying to figure out why my teaching and translating seemed to be different from other people's, and I think it was largely because of Wittgenstein. It's just been extremely helpful and helped me to see through. One of the things I would do when I working with students, I would listen very, very carefully to how they said things, because often how they said things more than what they said would tell me what was going on. I mean, one very clear example, a student seeing me, and we talked about practice, etc. And just before she left, she said, "My mother's dying. I really dread her dying." And she left. And I went, why did she use the word dread? And so I thought about that. And when she came to see me again a couple of weeks later, I said to her, "So, what's your mother carrying for you that you don't want to face when she dies?" And opened up a rather fruitful conversation. So if you listen very, very carefully, not just to the words, but also to the grammar, they'll often tell you what's going on in yourself as much as well as the other. I mean, I've sometimes find myself talking to myself in a certain way, and some pattern or something has come up and going, wow, that's interesting. So listening, I found as being very, very helpful. Deep listening. Where are we for time? I have no idea. I haven't even got a clock in front of me.
We're coming up to the hour. We have another 5 minutes or so before we'll stop the recording.
Somebody throw a question at me then. I've been talking too much.
I'd like to invite Verena to throw a question. If you're there, Verena, you popped something in the chat earlier. Are you around?
I'm not sure that she is.
Oh, Rory.
Oh, there she is. Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
here.
there you are.
Can I?
Off you go, Verena.
Okay, great. I was having a technical issue. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
I've been practicing Vajrayana, specifically Yidam, for about 4 or 5 years, sort of half-assed in the beginning, and then with more and more sincerity over the last 2 or 3, I'd say. And your book had a huge effect on my practice. And I think one of the things that it did was it sort of strengthened the intuition I was having, that to just, read these pre-written prayers and do the mudras and kind of going through the motions wasn't working. And on some yidams, as the practice deepened, it would become more of a heart practice and of a relational practice with the yidam. And your book was the first instruction I've ever gotten from a Tibetan or a Westerner that made that really explicit. Like, there was so many moments where I was, in tears about how you were relating to White Tara in your book that really matched like glimpses I would have in my own practice, but that those glimpses were never like affirmed or taught by any of my teachers. And I haven't had that many Western teachers. Most of them have been Tibetan. But so first I wanted to express my appreciation for you there, because I think if I had read that when I started Vajrayana, I would have saved, 3 years of flopping around in texts.
If I'd read this 50 years ago, it would have saved me a tremendous amount of grief.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess my question is like, what is going on in Vajrayana in the West? Like, why is it working so poorly most of the time? Why are the teachers not teaching this stuff? Because they're like, most of the lineages I'm involved in are real lineage. They certainly act like they're wanting their students to go through this development. Why is this not being taught like that? And is it just that it works much better for the Tibetans, or is something getting really lost in translation?
There are many facets to that question. Well, first, I'm very, very glad to hear that the book had the effect that it did, because that was the core of my intention in writing it. And I wrote it for precisely the reasons that you're asking this question. One thing it's quite important to me is that This book is part of a trilogy. I didn't realize it at the beginning, but as it began to take shape, I went, oh. The trilogy is Reflections on Silver River, The Magic of Vajrayana, and then A Trackless Path. Reflections on Silver River is a translation commentary on the poem written in the 14th century by Tome Zongpo, which is basically a lamrim, and it covers all the basic stuff in Mahayana Buddhism. And then The Magic of Vajrayana, as I say somewhere or other, takes you through the deep purification practices of this approach to practice. And then A Trackless Path is about the practice of timeless awareness, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, whatever you want to call it. And I didn't write these as a trilogy. It just, they actually fell together that way. And I make this point because you can't practice Vajrayana unless you're, Vajrayana is one part of Mahayana, and you have to be fully steeped in Mahayana. I feel. There are many places where things haven't come across in the transmission from Tibetans to Westerners. There's a huge cultural gap. The magnitude of this cultural gap is something that I don't think most people can appreciate. Is it okay if we go a bit over, Charlie?
Totally, yeah.
2012, I visited some friends of mine in Croatia and stayed there for a couple of months. I had time to have many conversations. And I grew up in Canada. And one of the things they pointed out about Croatia, and I think this is true of all of the Balkans, or the Balkan states, is that for the last 5 generations, with the exception of the current generation, but the preceding 5 generations, the people who would have grown into running the country were all killed. I grew up in Canada where that hasn't happened to any of the generations. There was a lot of people died in the First World War and the Second World War, but not everybody who ran the country or was learning how to run the country. I realized I had grown up in an extraordinarily stable environment. Tibetan culture has not changed, or did not change until 1959. It hadn't changed appreciably for 1,000 years. It is far easier. There's no contest. I can read a book written in Tibetan 1,000 years ago, and I can't read a Tibetan newspaper today. Up until the cultural diaspora of Tibet, which is 1959. I could read any of the Tibetan texts there, no problem. Oh, their style has changed a little bit. The language hasn't changed very much. I can't read a book in English that was written 1,000 years ago. We have no idea what it's like to live in a culture that is that stable, that hasn't changed in 1,000 years. And you can understand why, having lived in a culture that hasn't changed for 1,000 years, Tibetans are running why do we need to change anything? And yet they've had to. David Chapman pointed out in one of his, I think in one of his blog posts in Consensus Buddhism or Meaningfulness, I'm not sure which one, that I or the generation after me were the last generation to encounter the Tibetan tradition before it was fragmented by its impact with modernism. And I'm very grateful for that. I have a Western education in mathematics, and I have a pretty full education in Tibetan Buddhist practice before it was fragmented by modernism. My teacher never learned how to use a telephone. He had heard rumors of the First World War. He hadn't heard a thing about the Second World War until he left Tibet. So I say these things because the cultural difference is huge, and it shows up in all kinds of ways. On the Western side, one of the very important things about Tibetan culture is that they don't even think about the difficulty of navigating through from mythic expression to between mythos and logos, where mythos is what gives life meaning and logos is how you navigate the world. So when you're reading a Tibetan text, the author may be giving you really hardcore meditation instruction, really clear and precise. And the next paragraph be incomprehensible because it's written in mythos. And we don't know how to read that. And to give you just a very simple example, in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation and Words of My Perfect Teacher and any number of other texts, you will see a phrase which says, you must have so much faith that even if you were confronted with 300 soldiers wielding sharp weapons, you would not lose your faith. Well, how often have you been confronted by 300 soldiers wielding sharp weapons lately? Are you sure? When was the last time you sat down to practice?
Yesterday.
Were you confronted by 300 soldiers wielding sharp weapons in your practice?
Not a single soldier.
No? Your mind was completely calm and serene and clear, and whatever you thought of just arose with perfect clarity, and you understood the nature of things and everything like that? No interruptions whatsoever?
No, that did not happen. Do you mean those soldiers?
Those soldiers.
Those soldiers. Yeah, we had lots of those soldiers.
But that's what I mean. Here you have this meditation instruction, then you have this statement, which is like, what? But that's the transition from explicit logos, this is how you do it, to mythos, speaking in metaphor.
That's extremely helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
And people don't know how to relate to it, but it's very precise, Every time you sit down to meditate, there are those damn 300 soldiers. Actually, it's probably more like 5,000. And they don't just have sharp weapons. Now they have, javelins and long-range missiles and things like that. It's and so Western culture largely lost its relationship with this mode of expression 120, 150 years ago. So we're completely unused to it. And if you want to recover it, read lots of fairy tales and lots of poetry. Are you familiar with Cinderella? The story, you know.
Yeah, my mute button's not working. Yes, very familiar with it.
Okay. What's it actually about?
Like salvation, hope, really pretty dresses.
I think the last one was closest. It's the experience. And children love the story, particularly if they're the eldest in the family. Because what happens when you're the eldest in the family? You have these two parents who are dote on you and take care of you wonderfully in every conceivable way. And then your mother gets sick. And she becomes unavailable. And then this other woman comes back who looks like your mother, but she has these two things with her, and she's showering all of her attention on them. And now you just have to help her shower attention on, and you're getting nothing. And meanwhile, your father's disappeared into business or something like that, and you don't have any connection with him at all. And you're utterly alone, and nobody's taking care of you at all. That's what the story's about. And so children, they don't even think, this goes back to what I was saying with Phil about listening to music. They hear these stories and it speaks to them, not through their intellect. My younger brother has 3 children, and his eldest is she's now a woman, 2 children of her own, but I was visiting them when she was 10 years old. And she was acting up a bit, and it was bedtime. And Oliver and my younger brother and his wife, they had their own business and 3 children. They were really busy. And Bridget, who's be a little bit headstrong, said, well, you're going to come tell me my bedtime story, right, Mom? And her mother just, no, you're not getting a bedtime story. I just got too many things to do to prepare tomorrow. And I said, no, it's okay, I will. So she got into bed and sat down. I told her a story, which it's one of the oldest fairy tales in Western lore. It's called the Conla and the Fairy Maiden. And you can find it on, if you just do a quick search on Connla and the Fairy Maiden. And fairy is usually spelled F-A-E-R-Y in this context, but I think you'll find it F-A-R-Y, F-A-I-R-Y. I think you'll find it without any trouble. If not, just send me an email, I'll find it for you. But it's a Celtic fairy tale, and about this, and it's a very good exercise in reading. I won't tell you what it's about, because it's a very good exercise in reading between mythos and logos. What's the story actually about? There's a little test I would give my students. And but this is a 10-year-old girl. So I tell the story, and she just looks at me and said, that's a wonderful story, and rolls over and goes to sleep. Because it spoke to something in her, which is completely beyond words. This is what the old fairy tales are like. They give expression to things in this poetic and elusive language that cannot be expressed in conceptual intellectual language. And we've lost our relationship with that. So that's another problem with the transmission. And and I've seen so many instances of this where the Tibetans are saying one thing and the Westerners are hearing something else. Red Auerbach, who used to quote the Celtics, used to say, it isn't what you say to the players that counts. It's what they hear. And this is why translation and the way I paid such attention to how I write, because as I was saying earlier, I want, when people read this, I want them to have an experience, because then I know something's gone in. And as long as it's in the intellect, I don't trust it at all, because it may not be the right thing. And so that's what I'm very intentional about that. And and it was the same thing when I was teaching. I wanted people to feel what it was about, because if you feel what it's about, then you know what it's about. And it's not just understanding it. And there's all kinds of problems like this throughout, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. So does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Even that cue about the way Tibetan texts switch at that pointer alone.
Yeah. And they'll go back and forth between that without, I mean, you take Indian sutras are the same way. My favorite example is the Diamond Sutra, or the Heart Sutra. Are you familiar with the Heart Sutra?
Yeah.
Okay. So you look at the frame story here. There's Buddha in some kind of deep state of meditation. At least that's how it's presented, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra. Now, there's a whole story behind why it's Avalokiteshvara Shariputra, but we won't go into that today. And but Buddha knows that Shariputra's stuck. He's stuck in his practice. So what does he do? He gives Avalokiteshvara a psychic nudge. You know, doesn't say anything, just a little energetic. Because Shariputra is, no, sorry, I got this wrong. Shariputra is sitting in the perfection of wisdom. And Buddha says, oh, that's good. So he gives Shariputra a psychic nudge. And Shariputra says, Avalokiteshvara, how does a noble son or daughter, or as a son or daughter of a noble family, practice the Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom? And so there's this dialogue. It's a pointing out instruction, the whole damn thing. And it does 4 takes on emptiness, then presents what it's about. But when I teach the Heart Sutra, what I do is I ask for 2 volunteers, one to play Shariputra and one to play Avalokiteshvara. And so I usually get someone, I usually get 2. And whoever volunteers first gets their choice of which one they want. So sometimes they take Shariputra, sometimes they take Avalokiteshvara. So I say, if they take Avalokiteshvara, I say, okay, you're the meditation teacher. And I point the one who's taken Shariputra, you're the student. And say, okay, now you don't have to worry about the Heart Sutra anymore. You're the meditation instructor, you're the student. As a student, ask a real question about your meditation. So they do. And then the person who's playing Avalokiteshvara has to respond to this real meditation question. And usually it doesn't go very well. So I said, so we need to do one more thing here. I need a 3rd volunteer. I need someone who's going to be Buddha. No pressure. So usually I have to haul somebody out of the group. Say, okay, you're Buddha. Now you don't have to say anything. It's very simple. I want you to sit, they form a triangle. So there's Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara facing each other. And then there's Buddha at the vertex of the triangle. I said, I just want you to hold a field of attention there. And most of the people I practice with, they know how to do it. So hold the field of attention. So that's all you have to do. And I say to the student who's Shariputra, you ask the meditation question. And Avalokiteshvara, you answer. And now it's completely different. Avalokiteshvara, or a person playing that, answers the question in a different way. And in almost no time at all, the two students are having a very constructive conversation about meditation practice. It happens every time. That's what's going on in the Heart Sutra. Buddha's created a field where this can happen. And yet this is mythos description of what's necessary. You have to have an open field of attention. And everything you're doing in your spiritual practice takes place in that open field of attention. And in that open field of attention, there's part of you that doesn't know and part of you that does. And they're always having a dialogue. But if there's no attention, they just argue. When there's an open field of attention, something very different can happen. Now, how many times have you had the Heart Sutra explained to you that way?
This is the first. It's really good.
But all of the sutras are like this. You know, and there's so much richness in these traditions that's being lost because of all kinds of reasons. So, anyway, back to you, Charlie.
Well, that was well worth running over for Ken. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Beautiful description. So a lot of laughter and nods and emojis coming up because here we are in Zoom. So I think sadly we have to draw today to a close. We're going to stop the recording soon, but before that, just on behalf of everybody, immense appreciation for everything that you shared today and for your willingness to engage and grapple with these really difficult questions that we have around different cultures meeting, around Vajrayana becoming known in different ways in the West, and to actually go there. You're one of the very few people who've been willing to take the bull by the horns or something, I don't know, to actually explore the difficult stuff that, you know, we've been talking about. So thank you for that. And outside this,
but there are a lot of people who are doing it. There really are. And it's not just Vajrayana, there's Mahayana. And
yeah.
I mean, you've got the same. It's really quite difficult. And a lot of people are doing it, but they got the tail of the bull rather than the horn. It's different results. Okay, back to you.
Well, maybe that a lot of people are doing it in very different ways, and we appreciate the way that you are doing it. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Mm.
Very welcome. Okay. So we have to end here, do we? Well,
We'll end the recording here.